Hi everybody, welcome back to our last video for period 2. We're going to finish off colonial culture. So again, just tracking kind of where we've been and where we're going. We've looked at first the framework of period 1, where we first saw the motivations for some of the general early Europeans coming over, number one. And number two, what was life like prior to these Europeans and how did their arrival and their contact with natives change things? Then we began to look into the differences between the major European nations colonizing what becomes North America and the modern day United States. We then shifted into more specific in-depth look into the British colonies of North America. And in our last video, we looked at what was it like to actually live in those colonies besides the broad motives. What was life like actually in those colonies during the 17th century? And today we're going to transition to the 18th century. So what we've been doing over the previous four videos and now this fifth video is we have been building up the context for the course. Now, this information would typically appear in the multiple choice section every single year, somewhere from periods 1 and 2, along with the possibility that you could answer information on this in one of the short answer questions and one of the possibilities for a long essay question if you so choose it. But the biggest thing to keep in mind is that this is good for understanding where our course begins, the broader context in which the course begins, number one. But number two, the only time you're going to be required to answer a question that solely sits in periods 1 and 2 is in the multiple choice section. After that, it's up to you. You could pick another option, but we'll kind of see how that plays into our discussion. This information could be useful to you in the future, especially drawing comparisons. So we'll build up what life is like leading up into the Revolutionary era and kind of what life is like before the French India War primarily, but there will be some bleed over beyond that. But we'll fit that to the broader picture and let's get going. We, of course, always look at our objectives. We've seen the context in which people colonized North America during this time period and why different European colonies developed and expanded during this time period. We've also begun to look at how the Europeans interacted with Native Americans and how this really changed over time. We also started implementing the discussion of slavery, the causes and effects of this in society, and we'll continue seeing some of those in today's discussion as well, especially the discussion of slavery and how that's changing in the 1700s compared to what we saw in the 1600s. And also how these enslaved people really responded to slavery and where this story continues. We'll also look at where these new ideas are coming over to the United States. And this is going to be the bulk of our focus. Objective H is going to be about the development of American culture, specifically during the 1700s. And finally, we'll see kind of how these different goals and interests of the European leaders affected the relationship here and kind of how the politics across the ocean did affect politics here, or how larger events began to affect colonial life. But really, the impact of the colonial development period is really what this entire subject is about. Past four videos and this fifth video have all been about Objective J, right? The effects of this into the greater scope of American history, more immediately into the American Revolution. So let's get going. Biggest thing I want you to think about today compared to our last video, in what ways were Great Britain's 17th and 18th century American colonies different? In what ways were the colonies similar? So you can look at that in two ways. One, how were the colonies similar and different in the 17th century, and how are they similar and different in the 18th century? Or how did they compare in the 17th versus the 18th century? So we'll continue to look at that discussion and bring up these ideas, similar questions I've asked. Now that you have more information, there's greater things that we can begin to think about and start seeing the larger trends. The last thing I want to reiterate before we dive into content is remember that in this course, especially during periods 1 and 2, specific information can help you for sure in the writing sections, but as far as understanding the broader stems of the course, the most important thing is to understand the general trends. And as long as you can find evidence to prove those general trends, you'll be more than good. The more information you can add, the better, but do not just get bogged down in fact recall, what I call word vomit. We can move beyond that. We are intelligent beings. So let's take that step into the future and really make sure that we can see the trends that are connecting everything. To connect to our last video, we spent a decent amount of time talking about what life was like around the middle of the 1600s. And in 1650, this is what the British colonies in North America really looked like. You only see some settlement in the Jamestown area versus the New England area. And other than that, it's sparsely settled in between, or there's not real settlements there. By the time you get to 1750, 100 years later, it's a totally different story. You see much more settlement, people moving deeper into the North American landscape. We also see greater presence of our European rivals in North America as well, with the Spanish immediately to the south, but then also the French. And there is that kind of white area in the middle that's a very vague, not necessarily claimed. There's a lot of Native Americans still in there. This is an effect of King Philip's War, where there's a larger Native American population west of the Appalachian Mountains, but also the French are there, and this exploration will be butting heads and conquests and issues with not only the native tribes, but also the other European powers competing over this land. This is where we are going to be headed when we begin period 3, when we talk about the French-Indian War, control over the Ohio River and the Ohio River Valley surrounding it for the fur trade. But we are eventually going to begin seeing pressure from every single direction. You will even see the Spanish coming up a little bit this way, but fighting for control of this waterway. The once we see really the true economic benefit and the economic prowess that the French have in the New World. What I think is important to note when we're talking about what life is like is to really look at partially demographics, even just population totals. When we're looking comparatively at separate colonies, when we're looking at the Native American, for example, the Native American population, there's 1.5 million natives, even after the disease have wiped out large percentages, large majorities of the native population. There's still the majority of the population on the continent. We see denser populations or higher populations in the New England and Chesapeake regions, and that makes sense because they have been here the longest. You also see high population in Pennsylvania, and then there's a sharp drop, even though there's a drop between the Chesapeake and Pennsylvania, there's an even sharper drop between that and New York, the entire lower South that makes up both the Carolinas and Georgia. The back country, so that sort of frontier out by the mountain ranges. Then you compare that to what the French have. Even though the French and the Spanish have a vast amount of terrain, way more than the British do, the British are much more populated in these territories, these colonies, than the French or the Spanish. The French only have 70,000 throughout the French Crescent and northern New Spain, and that's really referring to the ones in North America. There is population in South America for sure, and even Central America, but we're talking more about the things that are in the immediate land that we would refer to now as the United States of America. So the American Southwest, from kind of Texas westward, and then also Florida. So very sparsely populated comparatively to the British colonies. But outside of that, the Native Americans heavily outnumber the European colonists comparatively, even if you add them all together. So we're really looking at understanding how great is the Native American presence and why is there so much conflict, and what are even the other European nations doing. And by the 18th century, so by the time we hit the 1700s, the natives and the Europeans had a semi kind of codependent relationship. But it was more so the natives became more dependent on the colonists because of a history of trade and different deals and different expansion that was happening. When we're talking about manufactured goods that the natives could not get around, whether you're talking about manufactured clothes, they could have other forms of clothes, but things like guns and trades, they became integral and integrated into the native ways of life. A great example of this is how the Spanish horses completely changed the culture of the Plain Indians, like the Sioux tribe in the modern day Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming area. So this is for sure an example of how, now that this is introduced and their entire culture is adapted around that, they can't really transition out of that in any efficient way. So they really become dependent on the Europeans. Also, when we're looking at this relationship, which European country are the natives mostly reacting with? And this comes from their original reasons about why they came over. The French, the Dutch aren't really present anymore, so it's really the French are the ones that have the best relationship with the Native Americans because, right, the French are really looking to do trade. And so this is where this formed bond relationship really works and develops, as compared to the English, who are trying to expel them and they don't want anything near them, they just want their land, and the Spanish, who were originally trying to enslave them before that system failed and they shifted towards African slavery. So the best relationship by far for the Native Americans are those with the French. We can see here examples about how the use of horses has transformed the life of Native Americans. It's changed not only in the way that they did hunt, but also their entire culture became much more nomadic. They could expand, they could move fluidly from place to place, they could follow the herds of buffalo and American bison and other animals that they would hunt. And this became a key piece of what their culture was like. This map shows different Spanish settlements all along what is the southern half of the United States, the modern day United States. And this is by 1770, so right in the American Revolutionary area. The red names you see scattered throughout are different Native American tribes in these particular regions. The unique part about the Spanish control of these areas, as you saw on one of those earlier slides that showed the population totals in North America, the Spanish were very sparsely populated in these regions. Unlike the British that had rapid growth, the Spanish had much more slower growth. They never really had a military hold on these sort of areas or political hold, although they had claim to them. The natives, it didn't really affect their lifestyle in many, many cases. You have St. Augustine, which was the very first settlement in what becomes the United States of America. North America wasn't really attractive to settlers. It wasn't as heavily populated as one might expect. You're going to have something called the Pueblo Revolt in 1692 that is going to repel a lot of the Spanish explorers and Spanish settlers from that area, modern day New Mexico. And so as a result of the Pueblo Revolt, which is a relatively important moment when we're talking about the control of other European nations, the Spanish don't really have a good control of this northern Mexico, eventually southern United States, southwestern corner of the United States. And really the only major settlement in the modern day United States that the Spanish actually settle out would be out on the West Coast. But that doesn't happen until a lot later when they start sending missionaries out there in order to keep encroachment from other nations like Russia from coming into the modern day state of California. So there's not much control or influence over this area. So although the Spanish are present, they are not much of an immediate threat to the British. So they develop in a much more free way. The natives are not really feeling this impressment or control of the native population by the Spanish. The French in the 18th century are a little bit of a different story. The Spanish have definitely a slower population growth. The French do actually have some boom. By 1750, there's a 500% growth, but it's not because of immigration, it's because of reproduction. You're seeing people staying there for longer, they're having children, they're reproducing, and it becomes a little bit more normalized. So you are going to see a population increase, but not enough to kind of offset or completely rival and challenge the population size you see in the British 13 colonies. You will still see some people coming over as missionaries converting the natives, and that's a little bit more successful in the French colonies because of more peaceful economic relationships that are formed. And so these economic relationships are more than that in a lot of native cultures. They actually end up being more of alliances and cultural bonding. So it's a little bit more acceptable. You see a little bit more intermarrying. But as far as most people in the New France territories, the new French colonies, most of them end up being fur traders or farmers. And that's going to be the gist of it. It's not going to be as slightly more urbanized as you're going to see happening in the British colonies. The one thing that they do really have in the French colonies that is so lucrative, even though they're outnumbered by the British population in the British 13 colonies, they have control of the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River is the fastest form of inland travel, of shipping goods. They have massive controls of these waterways, so they have a really good control of internal trade, trade coming from Europe that can come right up the Mississippi River. And it is really like the highway. It's the fastest form of travel. You can also take the branch off rivers like the Missouri River, Ohio River. You get up into the Great Lakes, and you can ship those goods even faster into these different areas. And so it allows them to create a solid economic capital base. So that's what's sort of going on with the other colonies around us. So as you can see, the Spanish aren't really going to be that much of a threat to us. What will be more of a threat will be the French, or what will be more desirable is taking what the French have. And so that's going to be one issue that's going to lead into what's known as the French and Indian War. However, we really need to focus on what life is actually like, not just surrounding the colonies, but life in the British colonies during the 18th century. So we're going to focus on the growth of population and really the diversity that you're actually going to see in the 1700s in the British colonies. By 1770, the English colonies really, this is when they really start to distinguish themselves from the other colonies. Now, you will see a little bit of that in the settlement, but this is where it really becomes apparent. The population is literally 1,000 times bigger because of increased birth rates. The death rates were falling. There's a wave of non-English immigration. So it's not just the English that are settling here, but other people from around the world are wanting to emigrate to the British colonies in North America. You're also going to see a lot of economic prosperity that's beginning to surge, and there were new political and religious ideas that were starting to form. And this becomes very attractive for people that don't have this freedom back in Europe. So there's a lot of pull factors for people to bring them in. When you're looking at the actual distribution of immigrants in North America, what you can see is you're going to see one prevalent color when you look at this map, right? You can see green, right? That's normal. The green would be English, and so that makes sense here, but there's some other bigger colors, and so notice what you're seeing more than other places. Maybe you really see this yellow color, or this purple color, or this darker orange color. And there's other colors scattered throughout, such as this kind of teal color in the background here that you may or may not have been able to notice and distinguish because of the color of the ocean here, which is poor choice. But when you notice what these are, we can really see that there's a heavy population of English coming here. That makes sense. There's also a heavy African population, and we can assume that those people are slaves, especially look way down south, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, huge, even into Virginia, the cash crop agriculture, that makes sense. We see this purple being German. Okay, so we're going to see another immigrant group. We also see the Dutch here in the New York, New Jersey area. That makes sense because that used to be New Amsterdam. And we are even going to see in this teal color the Scots-Irish, so Scottish-Irish mix coming over here. So more immigration from essentially the UK, and you also see more pure Scottish immigrants coming over. So there's a lot of different types of Europeans coming over along with Africans, not just the English coming over, which helps make them very unique and diverse. And this is just a little closer zoom on it, and you can really see how all these little pockets, now obviously the green is the majority, but there are little pockets throughout, and then we're going to look at not only who is coming over, but why are they settling where they are. Notice that there are these new, more diverse groups happening on the western frontier of these colonies. So what is going to cause people to move there? Why are they moving there? Rather, why aren't they going to cities on the eastern seaboard? And we'll take a look at that. So by looking at the population totals, one of the earliest censuses that we have in the colonies is in 1790. By this time, America is its own country. We've drafted the Constitution. George Washington is the president. But what makes it so unique is by 1790, less than 50% of these colonists or people living in America were English. So less than 50% of the people living in the British colonies were actually English. So 51% essentially were not English, which makes it very, very unique. We see people, as you can see on this chart, we see African, Germans, Scots, Irish, Scots, Dutch, Germans. And one of the largest groups of non-Europeans, or really the largest other non-English group to emigrate, were Africans. And we talk about immigration meaning moving from one place to another, but we can read through that. It's forced immigration. They didn't want to be sold as slaves. They were brought here. They're the largest group of non-English to come to the British 13 colonies. And you're going to see another reason for increase in population as a whole, but increase of other people coming over, is an act passed in England called the Transportation Act that allowed judges to send any convicted felons to the colonies, almost kind of like banishment from England. And that's going to be one of the reasons why Georgia gets its start. It's kind of this hub as this buffer zone from Spanish Florida, the fear that they may possibly try to usurp and come up. But 50,000 people from England were forcefully immigrated to the New World. So it's a very unique situation. There's people coming over for all of these different reasons. One, for the different motives for coming over, people that could actually afford it, coming over as servants, people that are being sold into slavery, stripped from their homes, and then people that don't even want to go, but they're being forced as form of sort of like a crime. So you're going to get this really unique group of people coming into the New World. When you're looking at this population, especially when we're looking at the white to black population, what's extremely astonishing is number one, realize that there are Africans all throughout the 13 colonies. Now, they're going to be in much larger numbers in the South, and that's something that we can expect. But in these populations, the biggest thing is understanding that even the population in the North, they could be free. They're not necessarily slave. Just because you're black does not mean you're a slave at this time period. However, when you go deeper into the South, like Virginia and South Carolina, that becomes increasingly more true, where you see in 1750 in South Carolina, 60% of the entire population of South Carolina was black. That is a huge number. So we're seeing massive population totals, especially in these southern states, where blacks are actually outnumbering whites, even though the whites are the minority of the population, they have a majority of the control. When we're looking at the other types of whites that are coming over, and we understand the story of slavery, and we'll continue that story throughout, we see the first major group are the Scotch Irish, and they're really going to be brought in and allowed to settle in this country into the western frontier right on the border. And it's kind of the same reason why people were brought into Georgia. They were seen as like a buffer between the Native Americans and like Pennsylvania. But the problem is they didn't really follow the rules a lot. They were kind of this rough ragtag group of guys that were disproportionately persecuted back in what becomes Great Britain in the UK. And so they don't really have a great rule or example of authority. They're all about kind of individual liberty, doing their own thing, doing whatever. And they took land when they wanted to. They got into a lot of fights with Native Americans on the frontier. So there were some conflicts out there, but they were seen as sort of like a border. And these immigrants were allowed to move here for this reason. There was a little bit of almost like a wall between them. They're not going to be settling in the wealthier areas, the more settled areas on the East Coast. The other major group that's coming over, and we're going to see another major wave of them later on, are the Germans. The Germans are going to emigrate, but the Germans have a different perception. And remember, the Germans are not part of Great Britain. Germany is its own separate country. Scotland and Ireland not really looked at in the exact same way as Englishmen are in society, or the Welsh are in Great Britain, and they're seen as lesser, and so they're going to be looked at a little bit of contempt. So those ideas are still going to carry over from the English settling in North America. So there's a little bit of contempt for them. They're going to be shoved into sort of what they determine almost like the Badlands, the Western frontier. The Germans, on the other hand, were seen as much more practical, hardworking farmers, and the Germans are going to settle in the farmlands a lot in Pennsylvania, but they're going to not really shift over to this super Anglican style of life and culture. They're going to keep a lot of their German traditions. You see heavy German influences in Pennsylvania, and we're going to see heavier German influences in the 1800s when more German immigrants begin to flood over. So German immigrants come over all the way back in the 1700s, not just later on in history. When you're looking at these settlement areas comparatively on the left And on the right, you can see these patches of where the Germans are going to settle versus the Scots-Irish. And the Germans are settling heavy in Pennsylvania. They're also going to be scattered all throughout. The Scots-Irish, on the other hand, even though they're also farmers, they're going to have some overlap, but they're going to end up settling in different regions. Upstate New York, they're going to settle more heavily in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, and kind of that northern Virginia area where you're going to see it more kind of sparsely populated throughout. They're really going to go where the land is cheapest, easily available, and they're going to try to keep those transitions coming over. Now, when we keep talking about this region, because of these immigrants coming over, the American backcountry, the frontier, the non-settled areas, the more inland areas, become very unique. And they become settled in very different ways. The coast is where it becomes settled more so in the 1720s. That's where it's deepest settled. And then it's going to expand a little bit western by 1740. By 1760, which is towards the end of the French Indian War, getting close to the American Revolution, you were seeing deeper settlement in towards the frontier. And that is where a lot of these immigrants are going to end up settling because it's cheaper. There is less kind of precedent already set. It's going to give them more opportunities. It's also going to be the most diverse section. And this map does a really great job of showing all the overlap of all of the different people, whether it's the Welsh, the English, the Dutch, the Scots, the Swedish, the Germans, the Africans, the Scots-Irish, wherever they end up sitting, they're the predominant ethnic group in that area, and there's some blurred lines, some little overlapping here. But look at all these different groups, especially where those crossed lines are, the dense population kind of flooding into these areas. And why is this going to become the most diverse? Because the people that are poorest are going to be the ones leaving where they're from. They're typically not going to leave an area if they're very wealthy and they're at the top of their society. They're not going to leave England. They're not going to leave anywhere in Europe because their life is already good. Two things must be happening. Number one, they're low in the social totem pole. Or two, there's a lot of upheaval that could bring danger to them and strip that from them if they're on the upper crest. So a lot of people aren't going to leave Europe unless something is bad. And so because of that, they are going to be brought over into the New World, or they're going to flee and run over into the New World, and they're going to settle wherever they possibly can. The best opportunities are in the unsettled area, and so the western part of these colonies is where you're going to see the greatest amount of diversity all throughout what's known as the frontier, backcountry as well. Kind of the backside, the backyard, the unkempt, untended, and they're really going to settle a lot of these regions, which is going to allow for population growth to continue. And the early Western states are going to become much more diverse than the East Coast states will be as we continue throughout the 1800s. The economics of the colonies in the 17th century really continues to ramp up and becomes an important piece of colonial life moving forward, especially into the earlier reasons why the colonies decided to break away from Great Britain. The colonies themselves are part of a larger economic system that we referred to in our previous videos as mercantilism. They are part of this trade network where the raw goods in the British colonies in North America and even the British colonies in the Caribbean would be taken and sent back to England, would be manufactured, turned into finished goods that could be sold back to the British colonies. They could also be taken and sent to Africa, which would then be traded for slaves that would be sent to the New World to then harvest even more raw materials and continue this system kind of all in-house. This system is sometimes referred to as the triangular trade. You can see this name especially in this shape here where we're taking goods from the New World to Great Britain, from Great Britain to Africa, and from Africa to North America. Now there are some other trade routes, in particularly the name for the route from Africa into the British 13 colonies, sometimes referred to as the Middle Passage, extremely deadly for slaves, terrible, harsh conditions. In this brutal transport, being stripped from their homes and sent to this place all the way across the ocean if they were able to survive, and the traumatic experience along with it. But this trade network really allows for the colonies and the British to gain an immense amount of wealth. So if we're looking at this interconnected trade network, we need to understand, what do these colonies actually have to offer? What are they sending out that's so valuable to continue this trade network? Well, as far as the colonies go, the three biggest exports, the biggest one by far, most lucrative by far in the 1700s is tobacco, followed by wheat, and then followed in part after a little bit of a gap by things like fish, rice, and then down below even that indigo and whale oil that's valuable. And each colony kind of has their own sort of thing that they're using that's beneficial to this equation. But really look how valuable the tobacco industry is. It's going to encourage people to continue to grow tobacco to feed into this larger system, and they're actually going to exhaust the soil in the southern colonies. And so they're going to look for two things: one, more land to plant, and two, they're going to look for different crops to use to rotate in this process so that they don't dry out the soil of its nutrients as quickly as they did with tobacco. But these individual areas allow for certain colonies to grow in extreme amounts of wealth faster than others. This real transformation comes in the context of which we see the Spanish and the French not only lagging behind in the population growth in North America, but also their economies really kind of growing stagnant. And so the standard of living and affluence for Americans was much greater than any of those colonies. There's an increase in general in the American colonies. And as the population began to expand, the economy was able to keep in foot. And so it allowed for this continual growth. It wasn't just a momentary spike and peak. It continued to grow along with it. So you're seeing continual growth. And really this mercantilistic system, which we see represented in this cartoon above, really kept feeding that desire for goods. And you can see in sort of this cartoon, a little bit poking fun at it, where you see the boat for the colonies bringing in, and they're giving it to the mother country, who's turning around these finished goods that are bringing them back to the colonists. And sometimes the colonists would send them to other countries, which then there was greater restrictions that were put on there. But there was a desire, there was a market, there was always a seller for the American goods. The only thing that became an issue was the limitation on who they could actually sell with, and that started to sever some of these ties early on, or create some friction early on at least. This sort of relationship, this mercantilistic relationship, became very commonplace for the colonists all throughout the 1700s. But what became unique was that even though the colonists were across the ocean, they didn't really view themselves as separate. They just viewed themselves as English citizens living across the ocean in just a simply different region of the British domain. And because of that, they wanted all of those conveniences that they had back in England. And England was going through this industrial revolution, so they were able to mass produce goods at an extremely large rate. And so the colonists began to consume, not meaning to eat, but really to partake in or just to buy and purchase an extremely large rate. And so they wanted these goods from home. They wanted these goods from England. And this really fit in this model. The colonies wanted these goods, and so they provided with all of these raw materials for the mother country, who manufactured into these goods and sent them back. And the reason why the mother country, Great Britain, was very favorable of this was because all of these exports and trades and business deals were all kept in-house. All of this money was kept inside their empire. So they were allowing themselves to kind of increase in their wealth and prosperity, allow for this trade. They didn't need to outsource from other places to get goods. They could take care of it all on their own. It also led to trade in between the colonies, in between the British North American colonies, like in the 13 colonies, and in the Caribbean. And the British colonists were able to actually have this money to buy all of these manufactured goods. And so it was a good relationship, buying and selling with each other over and over and over again. And there wasn't this shortage really on either end. The problem is that eventually many different colonists fell into debt to English merchants who kind of controlled a lot of their business ventures. And so there was a little bit of kind of an economic shackle that it felt like for the colonists. So they began to look for means elsewhere, and that's going to create a little bit of conflict and friction between the colonists and the British Crown. But when we're looking at colonial culture and kind of what they're consuming, we see houses, what are a model of a house known as a colonial, very, very common in New England, a British colonial house built in the colonial times. and the way that they're built being very uniform, and this being kind of this little bit of a transfer from the from Britain into their actual colonies. We also see this in fashion for men and women. They indulged and they partook in British fashion. Now, they tweaked it a little bit to meet their own needs and what life was like in their region. But what's important to understand is they were proud to be British. We are not at a time where there's this huge separation. That's not going to happen until after the French Indian War, and that's going to take time to develop. It's not as simple as saying, oh, I'm mad, no, I want to break away. It's a built-up system of issues, and rather the change that happens when things are good, and when the British try to take away that or change things for their own benefit, it really creates a lot of friction between the colonists. That policy of salutary neglect is still prevalent at this time period. They're used to governing themselves. Economic prosperity, for the most part, is being felt here. And they have their own unique culture, but they're proud to be British. They do not want to break away. And this is colonial culture in the 1700s. And the colonies throughout the 1700s became more interconnected, but they weren't really unified. That would be pretty much incorrect to say. A great example of a little bit of this interconnection, economically at least, was something referred to as the Great Wagon Road. It's sometimes a minor part in really colonial history, but it's a great example that commerce allows sometimes for cultural diffusion in the same way maybe the impact of the Silk Road on European and Asian cultures coming back and forth. But in the British 13 colonies, there's a trade route that allows a lot of this commerce to continue between these different colonies, but it also allows them to have this little bit of interconnection. And so there's cultural transfusion as well. Maybe 5% of the entire colonial population lived in some of the biggest cities or the biggest port cities. Boston, Massachusetts, Newport in Rhode Island, New York City in New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Charlestown, South Carolina. But even despite those major trade hubs, only 5% actually lived in these urban areas. So they were much more sparsely populated or spread out across the frontier and rural areas. The cities were really geared towards some sort of kind of middleman trading, especially between Great Britain. But there was actually some pull to the cities, and this begins to see a trend in the middle of the 1700s. It's going to continue later on, especially into the 1800s, all the way throughout up to the 1900s. And even today, where cities really begin to attract people because of increased opportunities that they don't necessarily have. And so people are pulled, they can be pulled towards the frontier looking for land, but we're going to see an increased change where it becomes a little bit more urban, right? Moving towards cities. I wouldn't say industrialized, but more urban, where there are job opportunities, and that really begins to pull people into more of a city lifestyle. Politically, in the 1700s, we also do see some changes in the colonies, and this is, to me, probably the most important thing to really grasp before going into the American Revolution. What makes the English colonies unique politically is that they did not have this kind of centralized control from the crown and the government like the Spanish and the French had. The English were a lot more freedom. Were allotted a lot more freedom. And we kind of refer this to the idea of salutary neglect, that essentially, as long as the money was flowing, as long as they were being economically prosperous, not rebellious, the English government was going to give them their freedom. It was kind of like their reward. And despite that, most of the colonies, except for Connecticut and Rhode Island, had royal governors. These royal governors were sort of just kind of like pawns or place pieces, because all of the colonies had colonial assemblies that really actually controlled a lot of the local finances. But what's incorrect to say is to say that the 13 colonies were always this harbor for democracy, where colonies really weren't democratic. There is a large period of time where there is a economic class system and an aristocracy where the wealthy are the only ones in power, or the only people that actually do have power are those that have money and that have land. Land equals power in Europe at this time, and those ideas and values really do transfer over into the New World because you have a stake in the state. You actually have a chunk of the state of the colony, and so it means much more to you than an individual that doesn't have land. That's going to be the centralized argument. And so as a result, they're going to be the ones making the decisions. It's not going to be all of the regular little citizens. So there's going to be a change over time. Now, the Southern colonies are going to keep a more aristocratic form of government, sort of like this, throughout the 1800s, especially in the earlier part of the 1800s before the Civil War. But there will be some changes coming in different regions. So you could argue in a way that some things change while other things stay the same. So when we're looking at the history of where these ideas come from, we can trace it all the way back to the Magna Carta of 1215, the English Bill of Rights, or even the Zenger trial back in England. But what's more importantly to really see is kind of the general structure of what most of the colonies look like. You have the British Crown that appoints these royal governors, and the royal governors have different roles. There's the council and there's the General Assembly. The council, the Colonial Council, is really appointed by the Crown, oversees a lot of the trade, and so these are appointed positions. Meanwhile, the Colonial Assembly is made up of the actual colonists, and they are going to make laws. They have the actual authority to tax. They're the ones that actually pay the royal governor's salary, but they have the final approval on laws. So even though the royal governors are appointing the council, it's kind of a straight line up above them. You'll notice there's this back and forth line between the Colonial Assembly and the royal governor, where they actually do have some power in areas over the royal governor. So it's a very unique system where the people, even though not all the people, only a portion of the people, do have some power to check over the government. So the royal governors are the ones at the top of that. Most of them, again, were put into roles because of their family name or personal ties. And a lot of times they didn't really do a whole lot. They didn't really know what they were doing, and they really couldn't do anything autonomously. They were appointed by the king, and you're not going to double back on the king or backstab the king, or else you are going to die and you're going to be thrown out of power. So they really don't have much power at all. They're more almost ceremonial in most cases, or they don't really have a voice. They're kind of seen as like puppets for the crown. Below them, on one side, you'll have the governor's council. They advise the royal governor, but they don't really represent the colonies. It's kind of like the House of Lords back in England. So there is a resemblance even in their politics in the colonies to what they had across the ocean. But what's very, very important is to understand these colonial assemblies. These colonial assemblies are going to play a large role in the American Revolution, when there's going to be a lot of disputes and battling back politically, and then eventually physical violence and economic fights back and forth. But this was kind of like the House of Commons. So there were sort of two houses underneath the British Crown, the House of Lords and House of Commons. And inside of the Colonial Assembly, they were kind of autonomous, and they didn't really have to respond entirely fully to the crown in the same way that the instructions were given for someone like the royal governor, the governor's council. The Colonial Assembly was actually made up of the colonists, so it was much more fluid. 95% of the men in Massachusetts could actually vote and be a part of this, and 85% of the Virginian men could actually vote. Remember, distinction of men, not all. There's some property qualifications, different qualifications in each colony, but there are implications of power, of a little bit of history of democratic control and voicing opinions. And so when you actually see taxation by the British Crown into the colonies, it's not just the fact that they're getting taxed and they're losing money. They'd been taxed before, but the colonies, the colonial assemblies had decided this. So this is a stripping away of their power that completely changes this dynamic and this role back and forth. These colonial assemblies really felt like it was kind of like their duty to protect the liberties of the colonists, that they were the ones that had the direct power and voice to truly protect and serve the colonists. They were not interested in really doing what the governor said, who was kind of a mouthpiece for the king. They kind of did what they wanted. They wanted to make their people happy. They wanted to make their constituents, the people that put them in those positions, happy, making sure that they were taken care of, the vested interests. So each colonial assembly is going to differ in that they're doing what's best for their own people, and each colony is going to have their different interests. They definitely had a lot more popular support than any of the royal governors did. And they were the ones that controlled all means of really raising revenue, and any sort of taxes or implementations were done by the colonists. The colonists didn't feel like it was a foreign power. It was people that they actually had a say in, people that could actually dictate these taxes. And so when these taxes happen after the French and Indian War and the stripping away of these powers, it really sets up a compelling argument, right, for why the colonists feel so betrayed and violated by these rules. They feel like they're meddling in their lives, their power, their sovereignty, that they're treated as second-class citizens. And so they're really going to take a resistance to a lot of these early taxes that are implemented. It's going to be a huge change. So you could study, for example, period 3 without this knowledge, but it doesn't give it the same value. It doesn't give it the same content and depth. And so it's really important to use this for contextualization to really set the stage for these issues. So in the 17th century, England was really unique politically and economically with the American colonies. They were making the crown richer than it ever was. It was producing this very kind of lucrative offset of raw goods and raw materials that was really feeding this sort of beast. But in order to do that, they managed themselves differently, and it was not the same. And when these rights start getting stripped away, it's really going to eat at the colonists, and there's going to be some sharp divisions very quickly. Economically, we have this system divided by mercantilism, where the colonists are providing raw goods for the crown that is producing them into finished goods and shipping them back to the colonists to buy or to other people to buy. Meanwhile, you have this political relationship of salutary neglect, and as we see in the bold down below, as long as the colonists were producing and continuing to provide in this mercantilistic system, they would be given this economic freedom, salutary, or the political freedom and salutary neglect, that they can govern themselves. This was a huge change. It was not really seen anywhere in the world before. This was completely revolutionary. As long as they were holding up things economically, they were going to continue to have this political freedom. But after the French and Indian War, because of a series of continued conflicts and economic debt, it's really going to put into question the feasibility of the British's ability to continue the policy of salutary neglect. And as that ends, the revolution really begins. The only other thing we really need to talk about culturally, besides this political relationship and everything that's going on, is we need to talk about something called the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening is going to be a cultural movement phenomenon that's going to happen on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Some people could call this as a means of separation between the colonists, but also others could look at this as a means of binding the colonists with European culture. So in the 1700s, just to give you a depiction of what life was like, some context once more, right? In the 1700s, there was definitely a decline in religious devotion, especially, for example, when you're looking outside of New England. New England was this harbor for very religious people coming over, and then you have the Salem witch trials, and so there's going to be a decrease there. But outside of New England, 1 in 15 people were actually a member of a church, and so that's a smaller number. And especially New England is going to suffer a decline in church attendance, where a ratio of kind of like 1 to every 5 people were actually members. And it's going to be partly because if you could look at like the Salem witch trials that are going to happen at the end of the 1500s, but early on, there was a way of increasing membership in the church, because if you remember, in the New England colonies, membership in the church meant political power. So you wanted more people in. They still wanted to keep some sort of barrier. So something called the halfway covenant was created. So you're sort of like a half member. New England churches could increase memberships to people who were unconverted to bring them in, so you could increase membership in the hope that eventually they could be a member of the church and then have political power. So you're kind of you're giving them one thing to accomplish another. The problem is with a lot of these church sermons and these messages, they were often seen as very cold, impersonal, out of touch, missing the message. So people didn't feel that kind of emblazoned connection that they did perhaps earlier in the 1600s or in the 1500s. This is going to lead to this movement of challenging the prevalent ideas of the Puritan belief, Arminianism. It's not about predestination, where God is our to decide who's going to heaven and hell. There's the elect, the people that have already been part of this church. But this concept of free will, that you have the freedom and the right to choose. You have this ability to kind of dictate your path, that you have control over your life. You don't just have to accept things the way that they are. So this general question and this challenge of the status quo begins to lead to a new religious social movement. This social movement's called the Great Awakening, and it's the series of sort of religious revivals and spiking of religious participation amongst Protestants, and it really emphasized on religious conversion in kind of response to increase in these very popular traveling preachers. And they're going to be sharing these messages, but what's unique about this is this phenomenon is going to happen on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. It's going to happen in the colonies, it's going to happen in England at the exact same time with little communication between these major figures. But it's not a super unified movement. It's going to hit different places at different times. The Great Awakening is really going to hit, for example, the New England region in the 1730s, but it's not really going to get down to Virginia until the 1750s and 60s. And so it hits in different denominations, different places, different times. So it's not this general oversweeping message. But it's also not exclusively American. It's happening transatlantic. There's a similar thing happening in Europe. So there's some cultural cohesion where similar people can respond to what's happening in Europe as what's happening in the colonial life, but there are definitely changes that are seen. One really famous preacher at this time is Jonathan Edwards, and he kind of begins the first early parts of the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening in Northampton, Massachusetts, north of Boston. He's going to use really powerful speeches. They kind of use fire and passion to reach the youth who feel disconnected and discontent with religion, especially in New England. One of his famous readings, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, kind of this hell and damnation, but he's very passionate and blazoned, no pun intended there, about what he is speaking about and try to reach at the hearts of the people, not just kind of believe it because you can, but really try to ignite a flame inside it, the flame of the Holy Spirit, if you will, inside of these individuals. Encourages people to really examine their eternal destiny, like what's going to come from them, what's going to come for them. It's this encouragement of individual action of free will to really kind of take this course. The other significant preacher of the First Great Awakening is a man by the name of George Whitefield, and he becomes easily the most popular of the evangelists during the Great Awakening, and he is going to preach in these massive outdoor sermons, sometimes up to 1,000 of these outdoor sermons in nearly every single colony. So he's going to be traveling very heavily. He's going to have this very similar powerful message like Edwards. And he is really going to kind of disrupt the traditional established churches. He is going to claim that these ministers that you see in these traditional churches are not going to be taught to really see what he refers to as this new light, this inner goodness or this inner power inside of you. And so because of this, you're going to see people moving away from maybe the traditional church's centralized authority in religion and move towards a little bit more individual action. And this is a great example of a popular trend that we're going to see these ideas in the back of the head of a lot of the people during the American Revolution, moving away from a centralized political authority and individual action, taking action to the hands of the people a little bit more, but moving away from these people that don't really get or not in line with these new ideas that they value. This is just one depiction of Whitefield preaching in 1749. Again, these large gatherings, people coming around to see him, these powerful, fiery speeches. You also see Jonathan Edwards here as well. Now, what's important is not necessarily what's happening. So what's happening is there's preachers coming, there's kind of religious revival happening in not only North America, but also in Europe. But the impact of this is that essentially the message is these people aren't educated enough to really understand this new light, this new power inside of people, that they're out of touch and out of tune with this message. And so new universities are really going to form. A lot of major Ivy League schools and Rutgers, like Princeton, Dartmouth, Brown, and Rutgers are all going to be formed to really educate these new preachers. So increase literacy, increase education rates in order to practice this religion outside of the traditional institutionalized structure. You need to be able to read to access the Word of God. You need to be able to read the Bible, which is not, if any of you have ever really taken time to read that, or if taking theology classes, right, that you know that it's not the easiest text to read through every single time. So as a result, there's going to be increased literacy rates as a result of the Great Awakening. We're going to see this as really the first major national event in the colonies. It encouraged contact amongst these generally sparsely spaced and scattered colonists from these different regions, beginnings to come together. Now, we're not saying they're unified. We're not saying they're completely put together, but it's more than it was. And also the non-elites, right? The people that were not these massive property holders, that were not the clergymen, that were not the elect at the top of society, began to really challenge the social structure of society, and that includes women challenging structure. And you're going to see questions of why aren't women granted similar rights or more rights after the American Revolution. The same thing with African Americans. There's an early abolition movement that pops up right at the end or during the American Revolutionary War. People questioning the status that they're given right now when the religious message is something entirely different, or the reason they say that they're fighting is totally different than how they're actually being treated and able to live their life. So this is going to finish our look at periods 1 and 2, kind of the summer homework content for AP US history, and really a good way to step off into period 3, the core of the course, into the American Revolution. So just a reminder of what we've looked at over the past couple of videos, including this one. We started with period 1 in our first video, and we looked at the year 1491, which was significant as it's kind of a year pre-Columbus. Life before 1492 when Columbus sails the ocean blue. Life before the Europeans come in very large numbers. We're not saying that Columbus was the first person to find North America, because he absolutely was not, but the impact of Columbus is so crucial. The massive wave of European immigrants that come over. We look at Native American life before this and then Native American life after this contact, the effects on both the New World and the Old World. This is going to bring us all the way up until the first permanent English settlement of Jamestown in 1607, which we focused on building off from that English colonization. So period 2 begins with 1607, that first permanent English settlement in Jamestown, all the way up to the beginning of the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. We've covered a great deal of content in between this realm, such as the means that which all the European nations came over, why the different European nations settled the way they did, why did the English colonies, the different colonies inside the British colony, settle the way they did, how did they develop, why did they develop, the cultural developments in the 1700s and the cultural developments before that in the earlier years in the 1600s. So there is a lot of good content here, and this is going to really allow us to step off the year on the right foot, go right into the American Revolution, right into the core of this course. And these actions over the summer and other prep is really going to allow us to excel at the highest level by the time we get to the national exam. If you have any questions about anything in this video, feel free to drop a comment down in the section below. And as always, I will get back to you. See ya.